2 years ago, Americans watched in horror as a crisis unfolded at the Kabul airport.
She was tear-gassed and beaten.
Images of thousands desperate to escape Taliban oppression filled our news feeds. More than 80,000 Afghans made it to America. But the story didn't end there.
It was very cold. There was no power, no heat.
Who would help our newest neighbors? I'm Andrea Smartin. In Stranger Becomes Neighbor, you'll hear the stories of some remarkable refugees who left their homes and their dreams behind, only to start over from zero.
Their only possession was 3 blankets.
And you'll meet Americans who stepped up to help them.
You want me to come when you deliver your baby.
What can one person do in the face of an international disaster decades in the making? That's Stranger Becomes Neighbor. Find us at kslpodcast.com. Follow us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you listen.
Hey, it's Casey Scott. You're getting ready for another episode of Project Recovery. This issue deals with pornography, and it is a little descriptive and some adult language used. If you have young kids, I suggest you listen to it first before allowing them to. Welcome to Project Recovery, a podcast about addiction, but more importantly, it's a podcast about recovery. And when I say recovery, it means we want to celebrate all things addiction in the recovery form. And we're not just talking opioids, we're not talking alcohol, we're talking everything that you can be addicted. We want you to be able to share your story on our podcast. And if you know somebody who needs some help, have them do what I did and give Pinnacle Recovery Center a call. Hey, Dr. Matt, it's kind of with heavy heart that we start this podcast because just about 3 days ago, I lost a friend to an overdose.
Oh.
And he was, a friend of mine from 7th grade all up until now.
Really?
And I've been kind of struggling on how to talk about it, and I've talked to my kids about it. And the weird thing is that, this guy was just a gregarious, fun, outgoing, lovable guy. But he had his demons. And, it seemed as all addictions go, it worsened as the time went on. Yeah. And we all kind of separated. Part of that was because life. Part of it was because of, distance where we lived, and it just happened. But I think there was a general consensus among all of us friends that this wasn't going to end well.
You guys...
As the friends.
As the friend group.
The bros, the buddies.
And you guys have been friends since way back in junior high?
7th grade.
Yeah.
7th grade. And went to everybody's weddings. When we first had kids, all went together and partied all together,
Yeah.
But as life goes on, I had my own demons, my own problems. He had his, and our friends, and they just kind of separate.
Drift apart, you mean? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. And so finally somebody put something up on Facebook and said, he passed away, and this is what it goes. And somebody put something that just, it rubbed me raw. And I don't know if it's just me being sensitive or whatever, but he went out like a true rock star.
Huh, that's interesting.
Comment. And he did live life to the fullest.
Uh-huh.
Did a lot of fun stuff. He was a very caring guy and all that stuff. But it seemed like, to say that he went out like a rock star.
Yeah, what did that mean to you? Why did that rub you wrong?
Because he's got a wife. He's got 3 kids. And
almost glorifies what happened when you say it that way, maybe. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and he didn't go out like a rock star. It was sad and it was tragic.
Well, some rock stars have gone out that way, and it is sad and tragic. That's the end of their music and their talent.
But if I want to go out like a rock star, I want to go out with like a Paul McCartney. You know what I mean? With a bunch of money on the bank.
Live till you're 90. Right?
Yeah. Or Keith Richards.
Yeah.
And say that I've done all these things, I've made these changes, and he was an amazing guy, and I miss him, and I love him. But
how about your friend network? Are you guys getting together? Are you going to memorialize him as friends at all?
We're trying to figure out when that's going to be,
right,
and all that.
It doesn't necessarily have to happen like after somebody passes, but I'll be honest with you. There's the general funeral for most people and the general memorial service, but I've seen a lot of real healing power when when a friend group gets together to memorialize somebody who's passed on from that group. And I would encourage you guys at some point over the next few weeks or months to see if you can get together.
Right now, everybody's kind of just calling each other on the phone and going through text, and there's a lot of sadness.
Sure.
There's a lot of sadness.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of anger.
Oh, tell me about that.
There's a lot of anger where people are, this was unnecessary. This was selfish. This was, it didn't have to happen. And then there's, well, what could we have done? And so it's just all those emotions that are swirling around in your head, but it was just senseless.
Yeah, I mean, I think when somebody succumbs to an addiction and passes away, you can see the potential that was wasted, that the addiction steals that person's life potential. You guys knew him as a really great, productive person, and now his wife and children are left without him in their lives, and that potential is gone. And unfortunately, that's what addictions do. Over time, they wear a person down and wear them out and take away that ability to live a healthy, productive life. So I'm really, really sorry to hear that.
And I don't know if I'm just being overly sensitive because of our guest last week and Emily.
Yeah.
And it's a similar situation. And seeing Emily break down and talk in here and share her story and know all the troubles and trials that she's now has to go through.
Yeah, and now you're seeing a friend's wife and children go through the exact same thing, and there's just way too many people affected by addiction in that way. Families left behind when a person passes away. Yeah.
That's why I'm so proud and honored to be a part of this podcast and tell people stories. Yeah. And that's what we want to do, is be able to tell people stories.
Well, I'm grateful for the reach and the effect that the podcast has had. I think we've mentioned this a few times. When we dreamed this up, we didn't really know how far it would go, if it would really resonate with people. I think especially Emily's story last week has really touched a lot of people's hearts and minds who are looking at addiction from the family's point of view. And here now we have, you're part of a friend group, and it's the friend group's point of view where the friend group is angry and sad. I think about people I've known since 7th grade, and you feel attached and invested in who they are and in their lives, and it is senseless, and it's tragic. It's sad to have them pass on.
And when we started this, we wanted to kind of tell my story, but also branch out into all things addiction.
Right.
And we've mostly, 100% has been on opioids, alcohol, and that kind of...
the more I think about it, opioids continue to be such a focus of this show, not by intention, but so many people are affected by it. I was going to mention that my son, who's 16, just had his wisdom teeth out and was sent home with a narcotic medication, and I always have been a little hesitant about my kids or myself taking those things, but I see it through just myself through totally different lenses now, seeing how many people who get a prescription for a surgery and then it becomes an addiction. And I looked at my 16-year-old and I thought, man, we're probably not going to take that narcotic unless he really needs it, because I don't want to run the risk of my son having a similar reaction, an addictive reaction to it. So he and I talked about it, and I just said, let's see how your pain management goes. Let's use ibuprofen and acetaminophen, and we did, and he worked through it. And I was glad to have kind of a different perspective as a father, not as a psychologist now, but now as a father, to advise him on being very careful with those things. And I think I've grown a little bit doing this podcast. My eyes have been opened up a little bit on issues like that.
You don't want to dance with the devil if you don't have to.
No, and you don't realize that something like a prescription can be so deadly. A few, I was going to say sessions ago, because I've been working this morning.
Therapist speak.
Therapist speak. Episodes. A few episodes ago, though, we did talk about behavioral addictions, right? We hinted at the fact that we'd like to expand and talk about other areas of addiction that maybe don't get quite as much attention, but are very pervasive and damaging and harmful in our society. And it's been kind of tough finding people in those arenas, gambling, sex, pornography, etc., to come in and talk. It's been a little bit harder than we thought.
We've had so many people come on and share some of the darkest, deepest secrets, stuff that they've been holding on, and share them just so willingly.
I've seen you speechless a couple of times, which I hadn't ever seen in 15, 16 years.
With our audience, and then I was like, I want to find, because I know porn is a huge addiction in the United States right now, all over the world.
It really is. It's a worldwide epidemic.
And I've been trying to figure out how to get somebody on, putting Facebook posts, trying to talk to people and have them come on and talk about pornography.
Right.
And it seems like the stigma with pornography is worse than any other addiction out there. And I don't know if that's true or just my perception, but that's what it seems like when you're trying to get a guest. I was even going to go so far as to go to a Sex Anonymous meeting and just sit in the back and go down and go, hey, listen, my name is Casey. I'm doing a podcast. And
but you hesitated, right?
I did.
Why is that?
Well, one, I didn't want to seem creepy.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what goes on in those kinds of meetings. And two, I didn't want to walk in there and somebody go, oh, hey. And so the stigma, I wasn't even in, but I was worried about the stigma getting on me.
Right. You're worried about being associated with that, right?
Yeah. But the reality is it's a big problem.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of people know Chris Rock, the comedian, and it's very interesting just to highlight the pervasiveness of this stigma and to take it maybe outside of our current, like our community. Even somebody like Chris Rock, in his most recent Netflix stand-up special, he talks about being addicted to pornography. And when everyone's laughing and then he says that, I was addicted to pornography, dead silence. In this huge auditorium, nobody wants to respond about being a pornography addiction, and then he laughs and says, oh yeah, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but I'm the only one in here. And then they laugh, and it kind of brings the reality down to the fact that this touches so many people's lives, whether it's the person themselves, their family members, spouse, and it's a growing problem around the country, including girls. We usually think of it as guys being the ones that are struggling with pornography, but it's growing amongst young women looking at pornography. So it's an epidemic. Even Chris Rock is making comments about his own pornography addiction.
Well, that brings us to our guest today. We got Garrett Jonsson here. How are you, man?
Doing great. Thanks for having me today.
No, thank you for coming on and talking about pornography. So if you've listened to any of the episodes, we kind of like to start with someone's story and then kind of end on what they're doing now. So if you don't mind, how did your addiction to pornography start?
It's I think to give a little bit of context, it's good to know how old I am, when I was born, and that helps lay out how my challenge progressed.
Okay.
So I was born in 1986, and I was first exposed to pornography, I think, at the age 9. And
was it pornography in its purest form? Because I ask you that because I remember sitting on my couch and my daughter coming in, and she's absolutely crying. And I'm like, honey, what's wrong? And she had just watched a video of the Disney princesses making out. And it was because somebody had manipulated and put it together.
In animation.
And this wasn't the Disney princesses she was used to, and I had to sit her down and go, okay, this is when the internet was, and kids were getting on and going, okay, we've got to put blockers on. Yeah. We've got to know what they're watching because it sneaks in. So I guess my question is, did you search for it or did it find you?
Yeah, so my experience was that I was with my football buddies, and we were at a sleepover, and there was a show on. So it's not like a quote-unquote adult film, but it was just a show that was on one of the late-night networks.
Yeah.
And I was exposed to pornography. And from there, also a little bit of back history is like, for me, Casey, at least from what I remember, my parents never really talked to me about pornography. I grew up very fortunate in the sense that I grew up with great parents, But so I'm not blaming them at all. It's just the reality was we didn't talk about the harmful effects of pornography. And we also didn't talk about the aspect of healthy sexuality. And so my very first exposure was that, kind of to sex and to pornography. And of course, when you're with your football buddies, and because I'm a human being, a heterosexual male, it's like, of course I'm going to get aroused and get stoked about seeing a naked girl.
Hey, what's this?
Exactly. So, but there's also some confusion there, like what's going on, and so, yeah, from there it would be a thing that I would seek out from time to time as much as I could. I honestly remember in my basement, and this sounds weird, but this is what happened is like I remember seeking out like the fuzzy television, like the channel with nudity, trying to see a nipple or whatever it is, like trying to see through the fuzz of the television whatever it was with nudity. And it's interesting that at such a young age I was seeking that out in such a unique, kind of weird way.
Did you get a certain high from it, or did you know you shouldn't be doing it? I mean, what was the attraction to it?
The attraction is, it's like I listened to you guys' conversation towards the first of this the conversation we just had, and as I sat here and listened, and we talked about the substance abuse, and then you talked about how it's challenging to bring in someone that has a challenge with a behavioral addiction. And so when you asked the question of what happened in the brain, was it a high? Well, yeah, there's lots of science and research showing that the brain activity is very similar, whether you're dealing with a drug addict or like a physical, you're putting a new drug into the body, a substance abuse, or a behavioral addiction. The high in the brain is very similar. So to answer your question, yeah, like I'd feel high for sure.
There are receptors in your brain that we call opiate receptors, and they act as an analgesic or a numbing agent within your body, so your body can actually kind of go into some pain management if you're injured. There's also dopamine and other neurotransmitters that are kind of what we call the feel-good transmitters. And so our bodies are geared towards when we have a pleasurable experience, those transmitters are triggered. And so because sex and sexuality, sexual behavior is part of an evolutionary process, then when a person is exposed to something sexually enticing, then those receptors ping,
You're listening to Project Recovery. More with Garrett's story coming up next.
It's the story of an American held in a dark Venezuelan prison.
Then all of a sudden they all kind of lined up. They pointed their guns at me. And this is the point where I thought, I'm going to die today.
I'm Becky Bruce. I spent a year working on Hope in Darkness, which now has more than 2 million downloads. Find it on kslpodcast.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.
It's interesting that you said, that first, late night TV show you saw with nudity, you were about age 9. And a lot of parents don't realize that we have pre-adolescence, which starts about 8 or 9 years old for most boys up until puberty formally starts. And during that time, your body's kind of gearing up for puberty and maturation and those sorts of things. And that's a time when you're highly curious about changing bodies, sexuality. People talk about it. That's the height of time when everybody says weird things on the playground about sex. It's not true because everyone's trying to figure it out. And so that was probably a time in your life at age 9 or 10, that pre-adolescent time, that you were most vulnerable to have this pique your curiosity.
And I actually got my growth really early, like on an
early maturing boy.
Yeah, and so I think I was probably like 13. In regards to like my biology.
So yeah, and you might have been one of those early maturers, so you're even more susceptible to that. Things that kind of gross out a 5 or a 6 year old, and they're like, oh, I don't want to see that. By the time you're 9 or 10, it's almost magnetic, the interest that you might have in it. So it sounds a little silly to talk about looking through the fuzzy channels to try to see nudity, but that happens very commonly, and unfortunately we have access now that you weren't really having. If you think about mid to late 90s when you were that age, the internet was just coming into, that was back when you dialed up AOL and went and made a sandwich and came back, and then your page was loaded, right?
Yeah.
Like, so the people were just barely starting into having a lot of access to pornography, whereas nowadays it's instantaneous. But go back and talk a little bit about how long you feel like that curiosity lasted for you, and maybe walk us through some of those early years.
Yeah, for sure. So that, I would seek out porn as often as I could, but like you were talking about, there wasn't many opportunities to seek it out.
It was magazines or VHS tapes.
But I didn't have access to magazines. I didn't have access to VHS. So progressing, I used my mind. And to this day, I remember the image and the scene that I saw, and I can remember exactly how I felt. And so
were you the only one of your friends that was on a mission for porn, or did you think your other friends were doing it too?
Oh, for sure, it was a common thing among us. We would all look at porn. And actually, speaking of as these things progressed and seeking out more porn as often as we could, I remember going over to a friend's house after school, and I think I was probably 10 or 11, and we would look at Playboy magazine, and we'd use those images, and keep them in our mind. They're not going to go anywhere because of the way that it makes your brain feel. So we would use those images for as long as we could until we got to the next magazine or to the next video, and it didn't happen very often because of the time that I grew up, but that's how it started for me.
And so kind of what you're telling us is, in between opportunities to look at pornography, your mind was preoccupied with the next time you're going to be able to find it. You were thinking about, okay, maybe after practice we can go look at a magazine, or kind of planning ahead.
I think at that age, I don't think my mind was preoccupied at that age.
Okay.
It was just when there was an opportunity, I'd be stoked for it.
Okay. All right.
I don't know. It's challenging to remember and think back to my mind at that time, except for these specific moments of looking at porn at that specific age. But I'm assuming, because I actually remember, if we were going to this kid's house, then I knew we were going to look at a porn.
So you anticipate, that's something we're going to do when we go there.
Yeah.
Right.
So when you you do that from about 9 to 15 or something like that, right? Then you start dating. Does it affect your relationship with girls?
So I actually didn't date. I was very I was into girls, but I wasn't into dating. I was more about hanging with my dudes, my friends. And so I wasn't really into dating that much. But to 15 is kind of, let's see what year that puts me, 2002 or something. And 15, 16 years old at 2002. So the internet is hitting, but it's not fully developed like it is today. And
now, I hope this doesn't bug you or anything. Did you grow up here in Utah? And if so, were you a member of the LDS Church?
Yeah, so I personally don't talk about religion when it comes to this stuff because there's too much stigma around it. Mm-hmm. And so what I will say is that I grew up in a house that taught that it's important to treat people with respect, and that it's important to be considerate to people. I was taught those things. I was very fortunate the home I grew up in because I was taught those things. I personally will not go into my personal beliefs about God and religion because with this topic I don't think it matters because this affects everyone. And so I just kind of avoid that question. That makes sense?
It makes 100%. Yeah. It makes sense to me because I think we've known in the opioids and alcohol, it's not stronger in one religion versus another. It's universal.
People are susceptible regardless. And I think maybe you can tell me if this is something you agree with, that what we want to do is reduce stigma and shame around the use and addiction of pornography. When shame kind of creeps in and becomes part of the process, it acts like a roadblock for people to be able to get help and support. Shame stops us from talking about our issues and problems. And many people do find a lot of strength through faith and religious beliefs as they overcome their addictions, whatever they may be. But it can also act a little bit like a source of shame when you feel like you're violating God's laws and things. So I think it's helpful to focus on the science of it to kind of sidestep that roadblock.
because of my challenge, I've done a lot of research on the science of facts and the personal accounts. And one group, to kind of put an emphasis on how much it does not matter what your religion is or isn't when it comes to this topic, is there's a group out there called NoFap. Have you guys heard of NoFap?
No.
Nope.
So NoFap is a group. It's a worldwide organization, and NoFap means to not masturbate and look at porn, basically. And I think from the last time I looked on Reddit, they have like 400,000 subscribers to their Reddit. And I think that about 50% of them are either atheist or agnostic. So it shows that about 200,000 of these people in this organization or a part of this movement are agnostic or atheist. They're also dealing with the harmful effects of pornography. And it's not because of a moral standpoint. It's not because they think it's wrong or bad. It's because the addiction, the behavioral addiction is affecting them in a way that they want to change. They want free.
You know, I say it, addiction is giving something else power over you. And that's what it seems like with them, is that they don't have a moral thing against pornography. They just know that it's affecting their life and it's having more control over them than they would like.
Yeah, exactly.
So early 2002, the internet's becoming more easily accessible.
Yeah. Well, still at that point we have brick cell phones, like flip phones. I don't even have a cell phone at this time, but I remember once again the pornography. It started to increase. The frequency did when I was about 15, 16, just because of the friends that I had. They were great friends, freaking love them, and I'm still friends with them today. But with these friends, we would look at pornography. And it was kind of common practice for us to.
Were you using the computer
porn
at that point?
No, we were using VHS and DVD.
Okay.
And then fast forward to, for me, it really didn't become, so there's progression here. One of the common misconceptions around pornography is that if someone looks at pornography, they're addicted. And that's not true. Because for me, I don't feel like I was addicted to porn. Even at 16 and 17, I wasn't addicted. I probably had a compulsive behavior, like some type of unhealthy habit, but it wasn't an addiction until 2007.
What happened in 2007?
The internet. Like cell phones, all of a sudden you had a rectangle in your pocket with unlimited access.
Smartphones.
Yeah. So not cell phones, smartphones.
Right.
The first version of smartphones came out in 2007. Boom. Changed the game.
Because you had access 24/7.
And now you're a young adult, and you have maybe...
And going back to, like, you mentioned, like, the opioid connectors, right? And you mentioned... like some of you talked about developing youth and going into puberty and having curiosity. One thing that's interesting is that, and you can probably talk to this better than I can, Matt, but like the brain, they say that like the reward center is fully developed by mid-teens. And they say that the frontal lobes, like the decision-making area of the brain, isn't fully developed until mid-20s. That's rough. And so...
No, you're about right.
So it's a rough estimate. So like the problem is that with this curiosity going into 16, 17, 18, it's like your reward center's telling you to do something, but your frontal lobes aren't there to say like, hey, actually that might not be a good idea or that might not be the healthiest thing.
That's why teenagers get into trouble a lot, that very process, because impulse control isn't fully developed. That happens in those frontal lobes. So attention, concentration, but also your ability to use foresight and reason to control your impulses is one of the last areas of our brain to develop. So you're right.
So I think that word impulse is where I was at that point, up until 16. Impulsively looking at porn, meaning I wasn't thinking of I didn't have any forethought I didn't think about consequences. So I wasn't addicted at that point. 2007, boom, that's when I get the smartphone in my pocket and I start looking at porn. And I was dating girls at this time, but I was looking at porn as well. And
may I ask, were you sexually active at that time?
Yeah, so I actually wasn't sexually active, but I was looking at porn. I mean, I would hang with girls, I'd date with girls, like there would be physical intimacy there, but very rarely. Like I've always, ever since I was little, I wanted to be a dad and I've wanted to be a husband. Like, and I wanted to do those things very well. Like I wanted to, not like there's a good way to be a dad or husband, but I just enjoy having kids, like being around kids. I love that, and I
liked the idea of having a family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I was more about, when it comes to dating and being sexually active, I was never about like, let's go get this girl and get this girl and get that girl and get that girl, like the objectification side, or like not even stepping aside from the objectification side of looking to get that or get this in regards to a female. But it was, my perspective was like, I want to build a meaningful relationship.
I'm looking for a wife. I'm looking for a mother. Mm-hmm. I'm not looking for a number or a notch on the bedpost.
Yeah, exactly. And so mine was kind of, I'd say it's a pretty, for me, it was a healthy approach. I would date. If I didn't see that this was going to go somewhere, I'd be like, okay, I'm moving on. I'm dating again, date someone else. But I was always looking at porn on the side as I went through this process. And then we got married. I got married in 2010. And I didn't feel comfortable telling my wife. Like at that time, I didn't tell my girlfriend, or as we got engaged, I didn't tell my fiance, and then we got married. I didn't tell my wife about my challenge with pornography.
Let me ask you, when did you think the shame of how much you were viewing pornography became an issue? I mean, was there some point where you went, man, I'm watching this a lot. I can't tell my buddies anymore. I can't do this. Was there a point?
For sure. Probably around 2007, because we were growing up. I was hanging out with my buddies, but not as often because we were becoming adults. And for me, the shame came because I grew up in a household that taught that it's important to be considerate to other people, and I started running across porn because of the internet, because of mainstream internet pornography, and some of the sites out there with the auto-population. Like, you search one thing, and then next up on the auto-populated is going to be something very violent and aggressive. And so I would click past that. It's not something that interests me, but I would click past it. But then I got desensitized over time, and I started realizing, like, I became okay with violence and aggression, and usually that violence and aggression was against women. So I'm like, oh, shoot, like I became okay with it. I realized and identified that I was becoming desensitized over the course of from 2007 to 2010. So that's when the shame became real for me, where I didn't want to tell anyone. I didn't talk about porn at this time because I didn't know if anyone else had a challenge with pornography, and I didn't want to talk about how I was relying on pornography for whatever reason I was hiding, or whatever reason I was into porn.
In substance addiction, there's normally a point where somebody you get busted.
Yeah.
You know, was there a point there was no red flags to any family members or friends going, hey, you might have a serious problem?
No, so like I always enjoyed physical activity, and so I think I've done like the Wasatch 100. I've ran 100 miles without stopping, and I've done an Ironman, full Ironman. I didn't really train for them. And I'm not fast. I'm just able to endure, and so that's kind of what my strengths were always doing. I rode my bike from Vancouver, Canada to the bottom of Washington. Like, I do all these things. I'm always outdoorsy. I'm making conscious decisions, like conscious, ethical consumer decisions. Like I try to eat good foods. I try to all these different things. And so from the outside looking in, it's like, no, he's got his life together.
That's
dating.
A solid guy.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that your self-awareness around the objectification of women in the pornography that you were viewing was kind of that tipping point for you, where it probably went from something that you had previously felt like, oh, I can joke around with my buddies and we can look at some magazines or videos, to a shyness to bring that up and talk about it, a self-awareness that you're like, I've crossed over here. Did that cause you to think of reaching out and getting help, or to be even more private?
I don't even think at that time I was fully conscious of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think looking back, I can identify that.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember seeing that and looking back, because it's such a gradual process, that desensitization process, that I didn't even realize that it was occurring.
Sometimes it is only through hindsight and review of our behavior that we realize, oh, that's what was happening at that time in my life.
Yeah.
Because it is a very gradual process. Similarly to substance abuse, where people might use substances and, have a drink here and there and occasionally. And it may not be until they look back after they've become sober where they realize where those seminal tipping points were, where it went from casual use to kind of a dependent situation. Yeah.
Right.
So 2007 to 2010.
Just increased frequency. So then I'd say, there's days that I wouldn't watch it, but I'd say on a daily basis I was watching pornography. And so going back to my wife, like we start dating, we get serious, like we want to form a family, so we get engaged, and we get married in 2010, and I'm still hiding it. Like I'm doing great things in life and lots of aspects of life. But was your relationship with your wife, was that a healthy one? Without getting too personal, no, yeah, you can get personal for sure. But my thing is like, yeah, I think looking back, I think it was a great relationship, even though I was hiding this behind her back.
Well, let's get personal then. So, how do you think the pornography affected your intimacy with your wife?
Oh, for sure it did. So, I had just recently, to give you a little bit of timeline, I finally told my wife the truth in 2016. So through 6 years of marriage, she had no clue that I had challenged with pornography.
Wow, okay.
And just recently, fast forward to 2019, just like 5 months ago, I had a really big aha moment where I realized, so even after 3 years of kind of addressing my challenge with pornography, I'm still having aha moments, still figuring it out. Mm-hmm. But this aha moment was false expectations. And we live in a society that is hypersexualized. We live in a society that says, like, if you are this, then you do that. And when it comes to women,
sex sells, right? That's what you're talking about. Like, we sexualize things in order to make something look enticing or fun or interesting, even things that aren't sexual. In fact, often things that aren't sexual, they have a beautiful woman or a sexy guy selling it on TV.
I mow my lawn without my shirt.
Yeah, that's what I mean, right? Yeah. That's why everyone mows their lawn now in your neighborhood, right?
So basically, let's stick to porn. Since this episode's about porn, like let's talk about the false expectations that are perpetuated to both genders, male and female, by pornography. And for me, it was when I'm in the mood, and this is what was ingrained in me for years, was when I was in the mood to be sexual.
Game time.
It was I was in the mood and it was ready to go. And so that's a huge false expectation. That's saying that we should act on every biological urge that we have. And there's problems there. So that was when your question was, how did it affect our sexuality or our intimacy? Well, first of all, it affected my understanding of what is intimacy. Because for me, I started thinking that intimacy was sex. But that's just not true, man. Like, if I reach over to Casey right now and I go like that on the elbow, I'm like, what's up, man?
Yeah.
That's intimate. Because I can't just walk up to a stranger and do that. That's a portion of intimacy. And intimacy can be with my dude friends. Because I'm a heterosexual male, it can be with my dude friends. It can be with my mom. It can be with my grandma. It can be with my wife.
Yeah, personal connection, right?
Yes. So that was one problem. Another problem going back was when I was in the mood, I was in the mood. So if my wife, if she wasn't in the mood,
she had a headache.
Like, yeah, if she wasn't in the mood, then it was like, shoot, like I got physically like more like an emotional distress. Like I felt like she should do that. She should be in the mood if I am. And if she's not, then she should get in the mood. And that's a false expectation, man. And so my aha moment that happened in 2019, it's out of everything I've learned in this process, it's the one thing that I have most gratitude towards, that aha moment. Because I have zero expectations right now of when we have sex with my wife. Zero expectations. And it took a long time to get there. But it's the most freeing thing that I've ever felt.
How do you guys communicate about that now? So if you've had that aha moment and you've realized that viewing and using pornography and masturbation growing up created this false expectation, that when I'm in the mood, we should be able to have sex, and you had that aha moment realizing that's not true, how do you guys communicate about that now?
So I'll tell her if I'm in the mood, or she'll tell me if she's in the mood.
Right.
Whether it's a verbal tell or a body language tell. And if the other person's not in the mood, then that's fine.
So you don't take it personally.
No.
You feel like you realize,
Yeah, it's like
that's
we're both individuals.
That's normal.
But I think a lot of couples out there do
Struggle-
take it personal.
Definitely.
And they do think that, hey, we're married.
Well, I took it personal for a long time.
This is my right. This is your right, and this is how, these are the rules.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really healthy shift, obviously, in kind of recognizing how sexual intimacy works in a marriage. It's both people play their own role, and communicating about it, however you do that, is the key to being able to sync up and be in the mood together at the right times.
And I don't know if I'm just talking crazy, but I've said in drinking, nobody ever sits you down and talks to you how to drink like a gentleman, as they say. Nobody ever there's not a class on that. And what you learn is from your friends or from TV or from magazines or from movies. And so
and a lot of that's false information. It's bad info.
But this
right?
same thing, nobody ever sits you down and says, these are the keys to a good sexual relationship.
Which is too bad, because that's one of the most important parts of life. Back to your original goal of wanting to have a healthy, happy family. One of the things that is rarely discussed openly is a healthy sexual connection between a husband and wife is one of the foundational aspects of a healthy family.